In this video, we are going to be looking at elections and looking at why just looking at what the Electoral College results say is not always accurate to finding out how close or, not close an election truly was. And there are some years that I want to show you in particular that really highlight my point. One of the first ones is 2012. The tipping point state is Pennsylvania, Colorado, 5.4%. Those are the states that, really determine who won the election. And that's a big margin, considering the results were 332 to 206. You'd think that would be a close election. For example, in 2024, the tipping point state wound up being Pennsylvania at 1.7%. The math is that if Trump would have lost these 44 electoral votes, then 226 plus 44 does add to 268. No, it will be 270. It'll be 270. So that's like the math behind that. And again, similar Electoral College results as you could see there. And, and then 2012 that happens. 2008, 365 to 173. It sort of shows an Electoral College landslide, but not to the extent that you'd really believe, considering that, if you lose, considering that Obama, even if the nation shifted 5%, he'd still have the Electoral College lead by he's held the Electoral College lead by 21 votes. And Virginia on its own wasn't getting you to that point. You needed Colorado as well. And Colorado voted for Obama by 9%. So that's really a landslide. And obviously, if you look at the popular vote, it can tell you a lot too. But sometimes tipping point states can tell you more than a popular vote can. Because the tipping point state is how much would a nation need to shift uniformly in order to win an election. And then it's like, so as in 1996, obviously, 379 to 159, and the tipping point state was PA at 9.2%. That sort of makes sense. But then you look at 1992, and it's like, despite it being 370 to 168, so more of an Electoral College blowout than 2008 on the surface, it's like, it's just like, with 108 votes in a tilt column, that would mean that the tipping point state was Tennessee at only 4.7%. And that's actually so bad that it's like closer than 2012, which you'd never believe. And there's some even crazier examples further on. Like 1990, like 1988 is actually low-key an example of this. Where, again, looking at the tipping point state, it was Michigan at 7.9%. Again, a bit hard to believe that when you realized, just how much of an Electoral College landslide it was at 426 to 112, and we'll discuss factors as to why this happens after. Obviously, 84, everyone knew that the tipping point state was going to be, strongly in the Republicans' favor. But 1980, again, the tipping point state is closer than you think. The tipping point state in 1980 wound up only being 7.9%. Again, a little bit shocking when you realize it was 489 to 49. But again, a lot of states that voted for Reagan were relatively close. And we'll absolutely be discussing that factor behind it. So it doesn't always paint the full picture. It just, doesn't. And it really depends on where the close states are. And in some cases, it'll accurately portray the picture, but in some cases, it just won't. Like, again, this is 309 to 220 in favor of John F. Kennedy. Obviously, Byrd won Mississippi in a very tight race. And That came down to the tilt column. The tipping point state was either New Mexico or New Jersey, depending on on which way you calculate it. Either way, it was less than 1%, despite being 309 to 220, which, you know, made it not that far off from what 2024 was, where again it was 1.7%, so almost double the amount. And that's just an election that, I think can really be drawn to light. And then you go to older elections and you see again a very similar result. Because Eisenhower's elections in both cases, you could tell that there were landslides, 457 to 74 and then 442 to 89. But in a 457 74, what was the tipping point state? It was Florida, 14.5%. Actually, wait, that would have only got it to a tie. Oh, wait, no, it would have given Eisenhower the victory because of few electoral votes back then. Back then, there were only 531 electoral votes, not 538, because obviously, you have 3 representatives from Alaska, 4 and you have 3 senators and representatives combined from Alaska and 4 from Hawaii. So obviously, it changed the numbers a bit. Whereas in 1952, the tipping point state was a lot closer, with all of these states falling into the likely Republican column. So as such, the tipping point state, according to Wikipedia, was 11.4%. Not a huge difference, but a bit of a difference. And again, 1948, tipping point state was, and again, 38 votes wound up going to Thurmond with his huge wins in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. But, looking at a tipping point state, because again, that came down to Ohio, California, Illinois. Take the 25 from Truman away and he's fine, but in Ohio, but take the 25 away in California, and all of a sudden he's not so fine, and it would go to the Senate and House, which based on the results of the 46 election, would have voted probably for Truman, but based on the 48 election and that, massive blue wave, probably would have voted for Truman and not Dewey. For the record, I will never understand how in an election where Truman barely won the presidency, how Democrats flipped 75 seats in the House, which, by the way, this is this was a historic gain, and we've never seen a larger gain since. And in the Senate, how Democrats wound up gaining, 9 seats. I'll just never understand that. Politics back in the 40s, 30s, 50s was truly something else. And, this is another example. Tipping point state, New York at 5% was a tipping point state for Roosevelt, because if you take these 135 votes away and then you take away the 47 in New York, then simple math, that's 182 electoral votes taken away. Take those away from 432, and now you're at 250, and FDR doesn't have enough to win, and Dewey wins the election. Despite 432 and 99 seemingly being a blowout, this tipping point state actually made it closer than 2012. Again, it's crazy how that happens. And, the same thing in 40, when it was 449 to 82, and a tipping point state was relatively close. It was at 6.9% in Pennsylvania. And obviously what that meant was that with it being 6.9% in Pennsylvania, then obviously it was bigger than 1940 in the Electoral College. They go like, this is still closer than 2008 in the grand scheme of things, which I will never understand why. Side note: one of the other things I'll never understand is how come FDR won New York by less in 1940 against Wendell Willkie was also from New York. Okay, never mind. Obviously, 36, the blowout supports the results. And here's another thing: 1928 to 1932. Again, similar results in the Electoral College. Actually, didn't really not, because 444 to 87 is not as big as 472 to 59. And then look at the tipping point state. Um, you know, the tipping point state in this election wound up. Was it actually Idaho at 17.7%? That would be crazy if it was. It was Iowa at 17.7%. And in 1928, the tipping point state was Illinois at 14.65%. So obviously, that's a huge change, and I guess sort of reflected in the Electoral College votes. One of the other things that you have to understand about this is that this is probably the largest shift between largest nationwide shift in any election back to back. 1928, Republicans are popular. They're doing really well because, and then and the Democrats made the mistake of electing a Catholic, which allowed several southern states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida, and even Texas to back the Republicans. And then 1932, the economy crashes, and all of a sudden, all of these states that were, just solid Republican 40 to 4 are now solid Democrat. It's crazy how much an election can really shift, in that time. This might have been the biggest leftward shift, or really shift in any election in history. But then you also have to realize 1924, 382 to 136, and yet the tipping point state, as you can see, was clearly bigger than what it was in 1928. Seeing as the tipping point state was, depending on how you either calculate it, New York and Nebraska at 17.5%, or New York at 26.6%. So that was that. And in 1920, 404 to 127, it's not showing you the biggest of landslides. Yet look at what the tipping point state was. The tipping point state was Rhode Island at 31.2%, which actually might make that the biggest tipping point state in modern election history. Again, 1920 was really the peak of the Republicans' power. They never had more power after that. And it's obviously crazy to really think about how the tipping point state was such a landslide in this kind of election. And I didn't highlight some of the results in closer states. I closer states. I didn't always highlight the results of the election, where it was where it was obvious, but then there's still some surprises. And the reason why I didn't do that, and maybe I'll do it later, was just because it was all similar-ish. But 1964 is another example where I might tell you later. The tipping points, even though the election results appeared closer than 72 and 84, the tipping points, it was more of a landslide. But not as much as in 1920. And obviously, it's very tough to tell why these things happen. But again, you pretty much have the solid South all voting Democratic, but that's not the main cause that we're going to come to at the end of the video when I tell you why all this happens. And this doesn't look like the closest electoral college results in the world, and yet it came down to California at 0.38% for Wilson. Even though, I can think of some comparable elections that weren't so close. Because again, 276 to 255 is certainly close, but it's not you wouldn't think it's that close. 1912, obviously, this was the election where it's very tough to calculate because of the Progressive Party, which actually overshadowed the Republican Party. So we're not even going to really hit on this election because 1912 was just so complicated because there were three parties running. And 1908, 327 to 156, and yet look at what a tipping point state is. A tipping point state in 1908 wound up being, and back then only 483 electoral votes, so this is when you had less electoral votes. But the 1983 tipping point state wound up being West Virginia at 10.25%. Despite, the election results basically appearing to be, you know, you know, closer than certainly something like 1992. And 1904 is even crazier because look at where the tipping point state is. Now, back then, New Jersey had 18.6% of the vote, and Roosevelt had 248 solid Republican votes, and adding up 343 and 133 gets you to 476. So 476 divided by 2, you need 239 to win. Now, New Jersey had more than 9 electoral votes, obviously. So if Roosevelt lost New Jersey and every state before he would have lost the election, that's still 18.6% though, and the results at 343 to 133 don't really do its justice in telling you that it was a bit of a blowout. Because, I mean, it looks like 2008, which we already know how deceptive that was. 1900, another state, again, 292 to 155, it looks close-ish, but the reality is that the tipping point state came down to Illinois at 8.4%. But even then, this looks about as deceptive as 2008 does. As you go on through elections, again, you start to see just this overall pattern of where things get deceptive. Because again, the Electoral College vote shift between 1896 and 1800 didn't look too great. But look at where the tipping point state was in 1896. It was Ohio at only 4.8%. That's obviously a big difference, and it doesn't really do it justice in really showing that. Obviously, all these third parties do make everything, just very difficult to calculate. Like it certainly gets more interesting when you throw in all these third party candidates, which trust me, there were a lot more of them back then. But just weird where they are. Because again, 219 to 182 in 1884, probably doesn't show you that the results came down to New York, which Cleveland won by just 0.1%. And yes, I know it was New York because he loses those 36 electoral votes, he loses that election. So that was almost like one of those that was almost like like Florida 2000 levels of controversy. But at least in that election, the Electoral College vote was 271 to 267. So at least then you could sort of see how it was carried over. Like you never think that 1884 wound up being one of the closest and most controversial elections in U.S. history. And at least again, 1876, at least a very close result in South Carolina reflects the very close Electoral College vote. And then again, it gets 1872, 366 should look like one of the biggest blowouts in U.S. history unloading. And then you just look at where the tipping point state is, and you can see it's in the likely Republican column somewhere. It was, for the record, it was, either Ohio or New Hampshire. You could read on, but yeah. And then, it's tough to tell in a lot of these. I mean, like 213 and 21 looks like it should be one of the biggest blowouts again in U.S. history because it was truly just a blowout. But look at where the tipping point state is. It was Illinois at 8.8%. That's actually, closer than you'd expect. I mean, it was like literally closer than it was literally closer than 2008. And why does this happen? Why do these results happen? By the way, in case you're curious about 2000, this is what I meant about 2000, about it being very close. The main thing is that the tipping point state is going to really show how close were the close states leading up to where it was. Because an example, 2012, where I talked about it being deceptive. So let's go back to that. You had Florida, Ohio, and Virginia as close states, but that was really the only states that Obama won by less than 5%. Like where, and then you had this rush of states between 5 and 6%. You had Pennsylvania, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Iowa. You had Nevada at 6.7% and Wisconsin at 6.9%. That's where it all comes from. It all comes from that rush of states, but between 5 and 7%. So the tipping point state really shows how close are the states leading up to the president's victory. So an election could appear closer than it really is if maybe they didn't win a ton of states, but then the states that they won all or most of them convincingly, leading up to where it would tip over. Whereas conversely, if they won a lot of states, but they won a lot of states by a small amount, tipping point state does kick in, and it makes it appear, the Electoral College will appear less close than it really is. Because again, Obama really won a lot of these states. He didn't just win them, but he won them convincingly. And then, looking at the inverse of 88, you can see Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Vermont, Connecticut, Missouri, California, Missouri were all within 5%. And then leading up to the tipping point state, you have New Mexico, Connecticut, Montana, South Dakota, Colorado, Michigan. So even though, again, you didn't have the greatest amount of states, that led to Bush's even though you didn't have the greatest amount of states that led to Bush's victory, he still won so many of them, and that's why it appears to be a blowout. And I think 1980 is a more egregious example. But I am out of time.